Good afternoon, everybody. I have the pleasure and honor of introducing our guest, Anna Gifty Opoku-Agyeman, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about her and her background. Anna is an award-winning Ghanaian-American researcher, entrepreneur, and writer. She graduated from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County in 2019 with a Bachelor of Arts in Mathematics and a minor in economics. Her new book, The Black Agenda: Bold Solutions for a Broken System, is the first collection to exclusively feature Black scholars and experts across economics, education, health, climate, criminal justice, and technology. The book has received praise from the likes of New York Times bestselling author Wes Moore, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, and Chelsea Clinton. Currently, she is a graduate student at Harvard's Kennedy School studying public policy and economics. And in 2008, Anna Gifty co-founded the Sadie Collective, the only nonprofit organization addressing the underrepresentation of Black women in economics, finance, and policy. She also co-founded the viral and award-winning digital campaign, hashtag Black Birders Week, and one of the first conferences of the Sadie Collective was actually hosted at Mathematica in our offices. And so we are happy to welcome back Anna. And good afternoon. How are you doing, Anna?
Hi, Sheldon. I am great. Hello, everyone. It's so nice to see you all.
We are so happy to have you in commemoration of Black History Month and this really amazing and important work. We have provided a couple of folks with free copies of the book in advance of today's talk, and are just happy to have you and happy to welcome you back. And so to kick our talk off, I'd like to give you an opportunity to tell us a little bit more about yourself and about your journey to this important work and your journey through scholarship. So if you could tell us a little bit about sort of the process of kind of compiling this collection of scholarship and give us some insight into some of the challenges and things in terms of collecting and aggregating this work.
Absolutely. So thanks again, Mathematica, for having me back. This is such a full circle moment for me. In 2019, we hosted the first Sadie Collective conference at Mathematica. And so it's incredible to come back and talk a little bit about some of the work that I've been working on since then. So to your question, I think one thing I'll say is that I wasn't someone who was always going to do economics and public policy. I actually found out about those two topics as fields of study very, very late in my collegiate career. So I knew I was always interested in public policy, politics, economics, and that sort of thing. But I didn't know what the name was, right? How to name those things. And so I grew up watching The Daily Show, TED Talks, talking to my dad and my brother about politics, oftentimes just hearing them complain about Ghanaian politics and what was happening around us. But at the end of the day, I think I took a liking to it because it was really about critically analyzing the world around us and trying to find better ways to solve problems. And so, to your point, this book was essentially inspired by that very same sentiment. What I realized around March 2020 is that there was two conversations happening at the same time. Online, we had Black experts talking about how the pandemic that was onset was going to disproportionately affect Black and brown communities in a major and catastrophic way. On the other side, we saw in the mainstream media, things like New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, that those same Black experts that were having those conversations online were not necessarily being reflected in coverage. And so I don't know if you guys were following the news at the time, but essentially it took a very long time for us to get actually information about disaggregated data with respect to race and gender identity, with respect to how many COVID-19 cases were happening and who was dying from COVID very early on. And so those were the conversations that I was viewing as someone who was coming up through, the pipeline of being a young researcher and sort of thinking about asking questions around race and gender and how it intersects with policy. What was also happening at the time, too, is, as Sheldon mentioned, I've been involved with a couple of digital initiatives and, nonprofit organization building that has led me to have a little bit more of a profile than my peers. And so that being said, a lot of times what will happen is that when folks are looking for a young Black economist voice, they might come to me and say, hey, what is your thoughts on Janet Yellen? What are your thoughts on Biden? And I noticed that this was happening more frequently, obviously, after the summer of 2020 and during the summer of 2020 when the racial reckoning was sort of rearing its head, right? And so Another thing that I noticed was that, look, I'm not the, be all expert on Black folks in economics. There are Black economists who have been doing this work and who understand the literature and understand the research a lot better than I do. And I remember, I had a Marketplace interview, and there's a funny story around that. They had called me, and I didn't realize it was Marketplace. I was like, who's called Marketplace, literally? And so I'm talking to Kai Rizendahl, and I was like, I don't know who this man is. And he was like, he said something like, oh, I guess you have a lot of work to do. And I was like, actually, we have a lot of work to do. And I didn't realize that at that moment I was correcting him on air, right? And so that being said, the conversation was delightful. And at the end, they said, who should we invite next? And so I said, look, you want to invite Janelle Jones next. You want to invite Benga Ajolore next. There were a number of people who are actually in the book that I mentioned as potential guests. And what I didn't recognize was that they were actually going to book all of them within the span of 3 or 4 months. And so that's kind of when I also realized too, like the superpower of just bringing voices to light and using my platform, however big or small it may be, to amplify individuals. As you can imagine, these individuals, especially during 2020 through 2021, were exceptionally busy. So that was the challenge, right? Gathering all of these voices together, editing the drafts of essays that they had to provide, taking academic speak and boiling it down to the essence of the argument. Those were the challenges that I really faced. But ultimately, it came out really great, as you can see. And I'm really excited that folks get to learn more about these Black voices in the mainstream.
Agreed. And I think it's a great lesson to take from your narrative about the real challenge of research work and research agenda, being able to disseminate and actually connect folks through the research work to the important information needed to really make critical decisions. And that's something that, I think for most of our audience here today, we've all struggled with and really thought critically about how do we make sure that our information gets into the hands of decision makers, and how do we make sure that the viewpoints and the information they are getting is from a diverse and sort of
right.
multiple perspectives from multiple perspectives. And so speaking of which, so I'd like to kind of start delving into some of the specific items in the Black agenda and some of the specific items in your book. Particularly was struck by the criminal justice chapter in the wake of realizing now that another family is in mourning at the loss of their child, Amir Locke. I read this book with a certain level of thinking about how do we increase the urgency around some of these critical issues. And so in thinking about the criminal justice chapter and some of the voices that you brought together to sort of talk about the broader issues, what are some of the key takeaways, or what are the things that you think those particular scholars brought to the table to sort of really emphasize the urgency?
I love the criminal justice chapter a lot. It might be one of my more favorite chapters. Not saying that I don't like all of them. I love all of them equally, right? But it's a chapter, in my opinion, that lays out the spectrum of solutions that people are thinking about right now, right? So you have, Dr. Jamie Cunningham talking about how police diversity and technology could potentially be used to mitigate bias. And then you have, Dr. Hedwig Lee, who says we actually need to have a real conversation around the Black women and children who are left behind by this disproportionate mass incarceration of Black men in these communities. And then it goes into, sort of, Tahir Duckett's essay where he says, get rid of the whole thing, right? Like abolition, right? Where he says, look, it's not necessarily about removing police entirely, but it's also about recognizing that the current system as it stands is not serving everyone. And so we need to really grapple with that truth and then find different solutions that allow us to invest in other mechanisms to help those who might, be more likely to be incarcerated or might be criminalized given whatever activity that they engage in. And then it ends with, Preston Mitchum, who actually did an event with Urban Institute recently where he talked about how, LGBTQ plus individuals are already over policed. And then when you add the Black identity to that, that becomes just a disproportionate amount of harm. And so he also echoes Tahir's, sentiments around abolition and how that might actually, lead to investments in different types of ways that we already engage with folks in that community. And so one thing I would say about how the scholars laid out this chapter is that they focused on the facts. And I think that a lot of time when we're talking about criminal justice, it's very much, a conversation around how does this make me feel? How does this make me, feel in respect to, like, man, another person has died at the hands of police. Man, another, trial went away that we didn't want it to go. And, on the opposite end, well, I think that police are good people. And, there's these feelings that are attached to it. And that's, very real and very valid. But the truth of the matter is the facts lay out what's going on pretty clearly. I'm going to read a couple of them to you. So, for example, in light of what happened with Amir, out of 17,500 police killings, between 2005 and 2021, only 140 police officers were indicted on murder or manslaughter charges, right? So that was what the case just happened with Kim Potter, that she was not essentially indicted on this in a way that she should have been, according to the families that were involved. The other thing that was mentioned, too, is that 800,000 people are in the U.S. police force, which makes it the 6th largest army, technically, in the world. That is crazy, right? And so one thing that is so interesting about the criminal justice section is that in a way, criminal justice is the common thread that connects every single section of the book. If you pay close attention, you'll see that at least one essay in every single section of the book brings up the fact that Black people are criminalized. It's illegal to be Black in America. Walking around as a Black person can get you killed. It can get you severely harmed. It can get you questioned, which can lead to disproportionate effects on your life and the lives of those who you're involved with. And so at the end of the day, what the criminal justice chapter and what I would argue the book does, it says Black life should not be criminalized. And therefore, we need to rethink about how policies are devaluing or undervaluing Black life and correct that accordingly. And so that's something that I really love about how the scholars in the criminal justice chapter lay out these solutions. And one thing I'll mention too really quickly is that the solutions range from, like I said, diversifying the police officer force, or, thinking about how we fund research and advocacy and grassroots organizations that are investing in different types of solutions that get at, what is typically criminalized by the criminal justice system. So these are different ways that people are thinking about the criminal justice system, but also thinking about how it connects to healthcare and climate and technology, and how those things come together to further criminalize Black life, and how we can use mechanisms in those specific sectors to then value Black life as it should be valued.
Agree totally. And in the same vein, I'd like to kind of quote a particular passage from Tahir Duckett's section on the carceral system, and
Yes.
reframe and emphasize one of the points you're making about sort of how the facts sort of diverge from the feelings. He writes, U.S.
Yes.
prisons caged 2.15 million people in 2017. That's more than the entire population of Nebraska, and reflects a rate over 10 times greater than Denmark or Sweden, and nearly 9 times greater than Germany. To believe that this system, the American carceral system, is almost just to believe that the United States is nearly 9 times more criminogenic than Germany. And I think, when you start to frame and think about sort of the facts and the evidence that we have in front of us, it's clear that the things that you're advocating for and the things that are sort of part of the Black agenda are not part of just a conversation happening amongst African Americans. It's a conversation happening amongst us as a nation about, are our systems effective? Are our systems meeting the expectations that they set for folks? And so in a similar vein, I think the health chapter and the discussion of scholars that you brought together around health and wellness sort of point to a very similar kind of dynamic where, the kind of outcomes that Black women face in terms of seeking out medical care are not ideal and not something that represents a particularly unique racial issue, but a larger national issue. And so I'd like you to speak in sort of what kind of things were particularly interesting about sort of your interaction with the scholars on the healthcare and wellness chapters.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for those insights. And I would say that with the healthcare chapter, it's slightly different, right? We are talking about healthcare a lot right now because of COVID-19, because of the pandemic, because of how, healthcare workers are being overworked by those conditions. And so, a lot of the conversation around healthcare in the mainstream has been focused on what doctors think. If you haven't noticed, right? Like you always see a doctor on MSNBC, a doctor on CNN, a doctor being quoted in an article. But we don't talk about nurses. We don't talk about epidemiologists. We don't talk about bioethicists. We don't talk about public health researchers. And so for me, I wanted to look at this healthcare chapter as an opportunity to shine a light on a group of healthcare workers that oftentimes are silenced because of the hierarchy that exists within the medical care system. And so a lot of the individuals who are in this chapter are nurses, bioethicists, epidemiologists. And that was intentional. I intentionally did that because a lot of times you don't hear from the individuals who quite literally are the backbone of the public healthcare system, of the healthcare system overall, right? And as a child of nurses as well, I had my parents in mind, right? Where it's like, I know my dad is busting his butt, to administer vaccines. I know my mom has, served as a part-time RN and how that might affect home healthcare. And so the way that we really sort of unpacked the healthcare system chapter was we really focused on, first and foremost, the systemic barriers that currently exist with respect to accessing health. And so, for example, there's one stat in here that I thought was ridiculous. It's it's in Dr. Monica McLemore's essay where she establishes, this whole problem around the diversity in the healthcare workforce. And she says there's something called the Flexner Report. It was administered in 1910. And what it essentially did was it established a healthcare hierarchy, the healthcare hierarchy that we see today, where doctors are on top and everybody else is on the bottom. But by doing that, it also simultaneously perpetuated racist attitudes in how we evaluate the healthcare workforce. And so what that report essentially led to was that many schools producing marginalized healthcare workers led to shutdowns in those communities. And the number of Black physicians that we would have had this report not had that impact, is 200,000 Black physicians. I want us to sit with that for a second. 200,000 Black doctors are missing because a report essentially and effectively enforced hierarchical systems within the healthcare workforce. What a difference Black physicians, 200,000 Black physicians would have had today. We already know that the medical workforce is being overworked by the conditions of COVID. If we had 200,000 more doctors, perhaps people wouldn't be experiencing burnout. Perhaps we wouldn't see, higher suicide rates amongst healthcare workers at this very time. And so there's real consequences to decisions that were made in the 1900s, right? She goes on to say that, what's happening with gendered racism deters Black women and girls from considering healthcare professions. And this is something that then plugs into essays about Black maternal and infant health, which come up in the wellness chapter, where we see literally differences in how folks are treated because of the color of their skin, how dark they are compared to other folks amongst their race. But the other thing that I want to mention in the healthcare chapter is that, Doctors Dara Mendez and Jules Scott introduced, this idea of thinking about a public health framework that integrates how we think about racism in the healthcare system. And they cite critical race theory in the correct context, right? They say critical race theory is a framework in which we think about how racism plays a role in how healthcare has been administered and how healthcare is being administered, And so they introduce a solution that they call R4P, which is essentially, thinking about how we revive and resuscitate the way we administer health. They say, look, we have to review the context, we have to reevaluate what's going on, and then we have to provide healthcare that is equitable and has equity at the center of it. And so that being said, that needs to be aligned with how we think about different mechanisms in which health is administered that is disproportionately representative of Black women in the health force. So, for example, caregiving was a huge conversation that was being had around the Build Back Better plan. And so Professor Yolanda Wilson says, look, we need caregiving to be legitimized. And that is because it's a $400 billion industry. And Black women who are disproportionately represented amongst care workers are losing out on those billions. And so in order for us to think about healthcare through an equitable lens, we need to start with Black women. How are Black women being treated in the healthcare system, both as patients and as workers? That is the way that we should move forward.
Yeah, I really thought that the way in which R4P was incorporated into sort of their analysis and used at the beginning to kind of frame discussions beyond was an important, and there was a sort of a subtle takeaway from sort of the way in which they talked about racism and its incorporation. For us at Mathematica, we really strive for objective research and an objective lens toward evidence. And in order to achieve that kind of objectivity, as human beings, we need to be aware of and really investigate and seek out our biases, seek out our blind spots, seek out the areas where we are not seeing the full picture. And so, whereas, you know, a lot of the sort of discussion around critical race theory in general has been sort of politicized, there is an important sort of emphasis to that movement, which is that as a nation, as policymakers, as decision makers, we should be aware that racism has created blind spots, has created a bias in the way we frame and think about policy issues. And I thought they provided a very constructive and constructive framework for thinking about how you engender and how you incorporate those diverse viewpoints into redesigning and rethinking healthcare practice. The other thing that sort of jumped out at me, particularly about the wellness as well as the healthcare chapter, is that it's pretty clear when you start looking at the evidence that we're stifling innovations. We're stifling things that could easily address and create better outcomes overall. I thought in the Diary of Black Disabled Women, written, I'm trying to remember the author's name, forgive me.
It's Tenu Abayemi Paul.
Paul, thank you. She noted that telehealth and virtual doctor's visits were a major godsend for her and allowed her to get access to healthcare that she didn't have before, and that those were things that disabled people were advocating for well before we had a pandemic that basically required and made it something that we all could take advantage of. So the way in which these kind of issues and biases will stifle innovation, I think really creates a powerful statement about why we need to really lean into and think about this, not just as agenda to address racial inequity, but an agenda to address progress more broadly.
Absolutely. And let me intervene really quickly here. I always hear organizations talk about how they want to be objective. They want to see both sides of an issue. And I want to be really clear about something. I have to be careful about how I say what I'm about to say. You can't be objective about whether or not Black life should be valued. You either think Black life should be valued or you think it shouldn't be. There's no middle ground there. There's no entertaining the other side of whether or not an entire race should be seen, heard, and legitimized and humanized. And I think that a lot of times, entities and organizations and different places like academic institutions want to say, well, we want to give room for both types of debates, both types of viewpoints with respect to whether or not Black life matters. And the truth of the matter is Black life mattering is a fact. Like, there's no debating whether or not it matters or not, right? And if you are asking questions about, what is going on with the healthcare system without recognizing that Black life first and foremost matters, and that isn't an issue of debate, then that contextualizes your problem and contextualizes your solution to then center equity automatically, right? Because you have this preconceived notion that, okay, Black life matters. So if there's a system that is failing Black life, then clearly that system needs to be fixed. Clearly we need to be asking questions and interrogating that system so that it can better calibrate towards solutions that actually help us all. One thing that Dr. Tressie McMillan Cottom, who opens up the book, says, she's actually the author of Thick and many people know her as a New York Times opinion columnist and a famous sociologist. She talks about how any institution that is not centering Black expertise is becoming a vacuum for white rage. And that is quite literally the fact. If you are not finding ways to have Black expertise integrated into the literal fabric of your organization, you are failing across the board. You are not finding the best solutions. You are not finding the best innovations. You are not finding the best ways to address problems that are ultimately going to serve us all. I always say that the ethos of the Black agenda, bold solutions for a broken system, is that the best outcome for Black people is a better outcome for every single person. Literally everyone else. Because if you think about just the criminal justice chapter, I was taking my notes in the criminal justice chapter, y'all. I was just writing statistics. I wasn't even writing broad, things like broad takeaways. It was just stats. If we just improve the outcome for Black folks in the criminal justice system, we would see a drastic improvement for literally everyone else.
Agreed. And, one of the areas where I know we have people on the call who are interested in, and part of the agenda that I don't think is often enough is discussed is around climate change and climate policy, where most people don't often recognize the dimension in which that has sort of racialized impact. But as you point out, it also is about better outcomes for everyone, and that we all share the same climate, we all share the same planet. It looks like you're having some video issues. Everything okay?
Sorry. Yes, I'm good. My computer was dying.
No worries. So, to the extent that we have, a real resource in your text, I think, and in this edited volume that you've created for helping folks think about and try to develop better policy. I'd like to get your thoughts as far as how you would like to see and what kind of actions you'd like to see come out of this book. Like, what is the types of responses and what are the types of things you'd like to see organizations do to sort of organize and mobilize around moving this agenda forward?
Yes. So I think the climate issue is really around the lack of Black voices that are being centered in that conversation. I mean, there was a period in time when we were talking about the climate crisis and it was only focused on polar bears and paper straws, and it was about personal accountability. And you didn't hear a lot about, how the climate crisis was systemically affecting different groups. I think that conversation has become more salient now because you have a lot of young Black and brown folks who are just standing up and saying, this is ridiculous. And we know what's happening in our communities, but more importantly, we also know what's happening with respect to the weather and how that is disproportionately affecting communities depending on how infrastructurally inept those communities are. Dr. Marshall Shepard, in his essay, talks about the climate weather gap. He says, look, what's going on is Hurricane Katrina was a glimpse of what we are going to see if we do not address how the climate crisis is going to disproportionately affect Black and brown communities. There are communities, quite literally, that are hotter just because of how the laws were drawn in the 1900s, because of redlining, right? And so those communities are now suffering because, there are institutions and laws and regulations that prevented those communities from receiving resources, which then prevented them from receiving infrastructure, which then prevented them, you know what I'm saying? And what we're also seeing simultaneously is gentrification. I know some of y'all living in DC, you know what I'm talking about. Everywhere is getting gentrified, where it seems like the only time when we see resources being invested into a neighborhood, invested into a community, is when a whole swath of white individuals, and I would even argue white wealthy individuals or well-off individuals, are moving into that area. And so that is concerning, right? This idea that, going back to what we were saying before, Black life matters. If Black life matters, then Black life deserves to be seen and deserves to be heard. But more importantly, Black neighborhoods also matter. Black communities also matter. And so you don't want to ensure that those communities are left behind by whatever climate policies, that you're proposing. And so what we see in the latter part of that chapter are a bunch of young people, one non-binary creative, Ari Linton Smith, Abigail Thomas, Mary Anise Heglar, who are like, look, we can't pretend like Black people are going through this climate crisis the same way that white people are. We are facing globally a completely different situation because of institutions undermining Black life over the course of history. So literally what we're seeing is, places that were previously colonized, places that, were, previously enslaved, communities that, were subjected to colonialism and Jim Crow and segregation and apartheid. All of these types of communities across the world that are mostly Black and brown are going to feel the effects of the climate crisis more than the white communities. And that is literally baked into how the systems have evolved since the very beginning of time. And so the solutions that many of them propose is basically based on the fact that we have to address the systemic failures that continue to undermine Black life. We have to close the racial wealth gap, according to Dr. Marshall Shepard. We have to think about environmentalism intersectionally, how we think about a holistic perspective around environmental protections and how we dismantle oppressive social and economic and political systems that are undermining Black and brown people across the world. We need to think about restorative justice, because the way that we are advancing the criminal justice system through prisons is not helping the world we're living in. In fact, building more prisons increases carbon emissions, and a lot of prisons are built next to environmentally toxic waste sites. And so it's not enough to deal with the criminal justice system as we are. It's not sustainable for our world, quite literally. And one other thing that someone mentioned is climate reparations, this idea of communities that have been systemically affected by how the climate crisis is affecting them because of the failures that we're seeing in policy, the failures that we're seeing institutionally, ought to be, essentially repaid for bearing those costs, right? And bearing those costs disproportionately. So these are some of the solutions that the climate space offers from the perspective of Black climate leaders.
Yeah, and one of the key takeaways, or one of the things that I wanted to harp in on or focus in on about the way you framed just the climate discussion, as well as sort of the next steps, is that we have to center voices who have the most direct experience with these problems, with these issues, in order to identify and recognize the relevant way forward. And, I think there's a similar theme and similar through line in the education chapter, where, we are at a critical sort of point in our nation and in our sort of global history where many of these problems, whether it be climate change or whether it be trying to understand and be prepared for the next pandemic, are coming to a head. We've talked about them and we've sort of known these issues were there, but the ability and the urgency to act upon them, I think, is one of the things that I really felt from a lot of the authors. And one of the things that, think about the education chapter in particular, recognizing the inequities that oftentimes were documented but just not acted upon in the wake of a pandemic became so extreme, became so overwhelming, to a point where it almost required folks to sort of lean in. And, one of the challenges, I think, is trying to maintain a certain level of energy and maintain a certain level of focus beyond those tragic moments, beyond those crisis moments. And so before we head and open up the floor to questions, I just wanted to sort of get your thoughts on sort of ways to, for lack of a better phrase, keep the energy, keep the same energy. About some of these issues.
Absolutely. The education chapter is very similar to the criminal justice chapter in that the facts are jarring, right? There's one fact that sisters and economists, Dr. Carrie Cruz Bueno and Caridad Cruz Bueno, talk about in their essay around virtual schooling, which has been a contentious topic, right? They say for every $2,227 spent on a predominantly white school district, students in non-white districts receive $1 in funding. That's an insane statistic, but it's also very, very real. And I say this as someone who has gone through the private school system. I was in private school from first grade basically half of kindergarten through 12th grade, and then gone back to public university. But I also was in public school when I was younger. The differences in investment are night and day. And so in terms of keeping the same energy, it means that, right after this event, Mathematica should reach out to me and say, how do we book some of the contributors from the book, right? That is what we mean by keeping the same energy. Having Black experts as part of literally the vernacular of your policy speak. Having them as not just the separate entity, right? When we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, people talk about it like it's some separate issue that is over there. No, it should be the literal air you are breathing in your organization, because quite literally, the way the world is constructed, we are diverse. We need equity. Inclusion is absolutely essential for us to see progress. And so it's not about having this be some separate issue that we're not worried about. It's about centering the perspectives of everyone, really, so that we get the best possible solution to the problems that are facing us right now. And so to keep that same energy, I always say a couple things. One, make sure that you are centering Black expertise year round. And if you need some advice on that, again, I'm happy to suggest some individuals, or you can just pick them from the book, right? For example, the other thing I will mention too is making way for the next generation of leaders of color, Black and brown folks who are coming through the pipeline. I think a lot of times people look at people like me or individuals like me who are a little bit more visible and like, oh, those are the people I'm going to support. There are so many young people who are doing this work and you don't know about them. And that's because you might not be looking for them. And so my huge encouragement to organizations like Mathematica is that you should be actively looking for young Black and brown voices to amplify, to center, to bring them platforms, because a lot of these young people are going to be reaping the costs and benefits of whatever happens after this next decade or after these next few decades. And so it's really imperative that they're already integrated into the conversation around how we come up with solutions around the problems that we are currently facing. And I think the last thing I would say is that there already are Black leaders and individuals in your organization. How are you uplifting them? That requires introspection. That requires whether or not you should reflect on how your organization is doing with respect to Black and brown folks in your workforce, right? If folks are saying, things are going wrong, things are going left, you have to recognize that. A lot of organizations I've noticed don't want to look within because they are afraid of what they're going to find. But you cannot move forward until you address what is currently happening and what has happened in the past. And so that requires you to have very hard conversations with Black and brown employees, but also have hard conversations about what Black and brown employees have said in the past, right? Folks say a lot of things during their exit interviews and people just kind of ignore that, right? That's a really, really great place to start. That's a very practical place to start. And I would say those are some of the things that I would say kind of push the needle, keep us pushing, keep us with the same energy. And hopefully we can kind of answer some of these questions to continue that energy through this conversation as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So thank you. So we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to invite other folks to contribute questions. Rick, do you want to, Leah, excuse me, do you want to say anything as far as how we're going to moderate? And I think there's one question I see in the chat, so I would start there. But for other folks who have questions, there's a Q&A box where you can submit questions. Leah, is there any other ways, or we want them to go through the Q&A?
Yes, please submit your questions through the Q&A section on the platform, and I will read them out loud to Anna. While we're waiting on questions to come through, if I may, I'm going to take liberty and ask the first question. Anna, in the preface of the book, you state that you really want to use this book as an opportunity to not only amplify Black voices, but particularly Black women
Yes.
in their voices and highlight their experiences. There was a chapter within the education agenda section where a educational psychologist talked about her experience leading an after school program, and she's mentoring these young Black women, and she asks them why they think they're participating in the program. And pretty much all of them say that they think they've been selected for negative reasons, that they're too loud, or they, they have behavioral issues. And she goes on to speak to how, Black girls how they view themselves is in large part by how they're mentored and who teaches them. And I know you have really led, just kind of this call to action to mentor more Black women, particularly like in economics and related fields. And so I just wanted to ask you to share a little bit more about why you think it's so important to raise the voices of Black women and to address the unique challenges that they face, being both part of experiencing both gender oppression as well as racism.
It's a great question. So the truth of the matter is it's a multi-pronged answer to what you're asking. I'm a Black woman, and more importantly, there's conversations ongoing in the policy space about listening to Black women. But the reality is people don't listen to Black women. People actually dismiss Black women quite a bit, right? And we saw this sort of shortly after Stacey Abrams, Miss LaTosha Brown, and several Black women in Georgia, alongside the Black Voters Matter community and a number of other grassroots initiatives, were able to turn Georgia blue, right? And so people were like, that's why we need to listen to Black women. We need to listen to Black women. And I think I had tweeted something, it's no longer there, but I tweeted something like, now don't say you're going to listen to Black women only to gaslight us tomorrow. And it went viral, right? And I think it was because that's exactly what it means to be a Black woman in America. And I would argue in the Western world, people listen to us when it's convenient for them. And then in any other instance, they don't. But I think what this book kind of makes a case for is that it's always going to be convenient for you to listen to Black women. Black women almost always are calling things correctly. And, Janelle Jones and Angela Hanks said very explicitly in their chapter, America's Best begins with Black women best, that the best outcome for Black women is a better outcome for everyone else. In fact, when Black women are succeeding, we see that everyone succeeds empirically, right? You close the pay gap for Black women, you close the pay gap for white women, Asian women, the average woman, and you also close the pay gap substantially for Latinas and Indigenous folks and Native Americans. So it's actually a really, really good proxy of progress to see how Black women are doing with respect to everyone else. With that being said, in history, we've seen that any sort of recovery effort we see in the economy and beyond almost always leaves behind Black women, despite the fact that Black women work our tail behinds off. I was going to say another word, but we work our tails off, right? And so that being said, what I loved about Dr. Lauren Mims' essay is that I saw myself in there, right? I've been called disruptive. Trust me. That was my entire elementary school experience. I was always the too loud one, the over-enthusiastic one, the one who had to use her inside voice, the one whose opinion wasn't necessary at the moment and then wasn't necessary at all. And I think for me, as somebody who literally saw herself in that classroom, it was incredible to see how she relayed how systemic failures against Black women were then internalized at the individual level, and how that came out amongst young Black girls. We're talking, they're teens, they're teenagers, they're younger. They haven't even seen all of the world yet, and they're already internalizing these harmful beliefs of themselves. And I always say this, the future looks like a Black woman, and we're seeing it little by little. Dr. Lisa D. Cook is about to make history, we hope, right? Hopefully the Senate hearing goes well. Indeed. We're seeing Janelle Jones making history. We're seeing Cecilia Rouse making history. We're seeing, Kamala Harris is the VP of the United States. We're seeing Black women in critical roles of leadership. But to your point, it's not enough. We need to make sure that there are pathways for Black women to enter those roles of leadership, that those roles of leadership have a legacy of Black women occupying them. And that is what I'm advocating for. We know Black women can get there. That's not the issue. The issue is, how do we ensure that there's a pathway in which Black women can get there whenever they want to?
Indeed. I'll just add.
Thank you, Anna.
No problem.
As a parent, that chapter in that particular vignette did sort of resonate with me to the extent that I am the proud father of a 6-year-old who was quite bright but quite messy. and having to constantly reframe and work with his teachers to make sure that the emphasis is on his academic success and not on his organization skills is one of those areas where, like you said, the negative framing, the sort of small efforts that have sort of overemphasized impact, where you just have to, and it's a blind spot. It's a blind spot for, I think, people responsible for education to know that, you know, those things matter and they need to be trained to sort of understand that in those contexts. So I hope that, you know, particularly that message reaches out and kind of connects with educators and folks about something substantive that they can do, and that the evidence is more than clear about the actual impact. We've seen it in countless studies. So.
And I'll say really quickly before we move on to the next question that, you know, if you're a non-Black parent who doesn't have Black girls, right? The way to ensure that your children don't dehumanize Black people, right, in their classroom is to get Black children's book, which is another essay that's in the education chapter. This idea of allowing the stories that are filling their minds and informing their imaginations to also include Black people. That further humanizes them as well.
Agreed.
Anna, we have another question, and the question is, how can we balance inviting Black and brown people into all of the spaces while at the same time not asking Black and brown people to do the extra labor correcting white supremacy?
That's a hard question to answer. That's the $1 million question, right? The truth of the matter is, it again begins with, you know, humanizing Black people. Right? You would not want someone to come up to you and say, can you do all these things for me without pay by Friday? You'd be like, the audacity, right? Like, why would you, you're not considering what I'm going through or what I have on the docket and whether or not even I want to do it. So, you know, I think with Black and brown workers in the workplace, and this is something I'm actually personally interested in as a researcher, it really boils down to whether or not you have actually engaged with this individual long enough to know if they would be willing to do that kind of work. At the end of the day, most Black and brown people just want to exist like you, right? And so, you know, we don't want to have to be advocating for our existence at every turn of our career trajectory. And so recognizing that is something that I feel like a lot of non-Black people fail to do. I also understand on the opposite end that non-Black people are afraid of doing the wrong thing. But you can't be paralyzed about making a mistake and then not, you know, acknowledge how it might affect Black and brown people in your workplace, right? You can't say, well, I don't want to be the one to organize that because I don't think I'm going to do it justice, and then use that as an excuse to be like, well, then I think you should do it. Right? And like I said, without pay, without extra labor being compensated. And so that being said, I would say that recognizing that that is a real thing, that there's a sort of like a tug of war situation going on there. But ultimately, it boils down to how are you humanizing your Black and brown employees and your colleagues? And don't, you know, place things on them that they didn't sign up for, right? And the other thing is recognizing that there are Black and brown people who actually do this work and they would love to get paid for it. But you have to do the extra step of looking them up, researching them, seeing whether or not they'd be willing to come into your organization. Here's where I'm going to plug another Black expert that isn't in the book necessarily, but it's someone you should absolutely invite. Minda Harts has an entire book called The Memo and Right Within, where she talks about how women of color should navigate the workplace. This is somebody who literally does this for a living, right? And so that's another person who I would absolutely recommend to come into your organization and, you know, maybe do an audit or whatever. But I think the other thing too to mention is that, you know, how critical are you being about how racial equity is showing up in the workplace? And this is really about audit studies, right? Thinking about, you know, as researchers, as empirical workers, people doing empirical work, right? How much of that empirical work is being shown back at your organization, shown back at your community? And this is where the question around, you know, if I said, can you disaggregate the data for me and tell me how your workforce looks like? Some people be like, what data? right? That it doesn't exist. Why doesn't it exist? Because you can't solve a problem until you know that it's there. Yeah? So that means that you also have to grapple with the reality of your organization and how it's currently serving its Black and brown employees. So, I mean, as a Black and brown person who's working at Mathematica or working elsewhere, set your boundaries. I know there's a cost to that. And I'm saying this as a student, right? But I always say that it's always better to ask for forgiveness than for permission. You say, these are my boundaries. Sorry. And if somebody says, well, you know, I think, you can then hit them back with, well, would you want me to spring something on you without pay, without you, you know, paying me an extra hour or so to do this work? Right? And this is, I'm hoping there's also leaders in the organization who are listening to what I'm saying. If you're going to ask any Black or brown person to do anything, and this also applies broadly to women, you better be ready to pay people for that. I always say there's no such thing as free labor. We're not out here doing that, right? Compensate for any sort of programming that you know is going to enrich the organization. Not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it also signals that that is something you value as an organization. If you are allowing people to do free work around diversity, equity, and inclusion, you don't value it. Because if you did, you would pay somebody for that. That's what I got to say about that. I know that's a little spicy.
No, and I think that's well put.
I love it.
Yeah.
And you know, one thing that I will add, you know, in regards to the sort of common sort of notion of anxiety or sort of uncertainty around the effectiveness is that, you know, I've been fortunate to be in spaces where this conversation has happened consistently over my life. And so the fact of the matter is that I've gotten better over time, and my understanding has grown over time. And the same principle, I think, would apply. And as we mentioned earlier, it's about keeping the energy. It's not about just sort of acknowledging it on occasions where you think it's relevant.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anna, we have a question regarding like further reading. Are there any particular books you would recommend our audience read after the Black Agenda? You touch on so many policy issues that we work on: climate change, education, health.
Yes.
You know, what are some other things we should be reading?
So I love this question, and I had this book in mind with regards to this question. So if you visit the blackagendabook.com, you'll see a resource tab. Feel free to click that resource tab and scroll all the way down to the bottom, and I list several books that are actually listed at the end of the Black Agenda book that you should absolutely look into. But I'll mention a couple just for the sake of time. One book that I really recommend folks who are interested in education look into is Ghosts in the Schoolyard by Dr. Eve Ewing. Many people know Dr. Eve Ewing for her exceptional work on Chicago school closures. For those who might not be familiar with it, Chicago had one of the, if not the largest school closure in history, I believe in 2015. I might be wrong with the date, where almost 50 schools closed within a month or so period. Another book that's coming up for those who are interested in climate is The Intersectional Environmentalist by Leah Thomas. I would actually advise that Mathematica invite her to come and speak about her work. It's exceptional. She coined the term the intersectional environmentalist. She brought in this idea of thinking about Kimberly Crenshaw's term around intersectionality and bringing it into the environmentalist space. And she's done an exceptional job of stewarding that. One thing I would also mention too is Race After Technology by Dr. Ruha Benjamin, who is a sociologist who studies how technology affects Black people disproportionately. And I think the last thing I would also mention as well is Thick. Thick by Dr. Tressie McMillan Cottom. I think it's required reading for every single Black and brown woman in the workplace. It's specifically essays about Dr. Cottom's life. It touches on personal and professional experiences, but it's full of lessons that I think that individuals should read. And even if you're not a Black or brown woman, I would suggest that you read it so you see how Black and brown women are navigating spaces that are tainted by white supremacy.
That's excellent. I thank you. And I will sort of add by recommending that the Black Agenda be on that reading list as
Oh,
well.
thank you.
And drawing us to a close, and starting by thanking you for giving us your time and your energy for this book. I really think it was, as somebody who studied race and politics and policy, one of the better things I've read in the last 10 years, and one of the things that I think where
Wow.
I teaching and where I involved in academia would definitely keep on people's lists as required reading to frame and help them understand and get a holistic picture of some of the challenges we face in policy and in policy making to improve equity in America. And wanted to just let everybody know, thank you for attending this book talk with Anna Gifty Opoku-Agyeman about her book, The Black Agenda. This recording will be available on Mathematica's YouTube page as well as our events page. And you will be receiving a post-event survey in your email. So please fill that out and provide feedback on the event. And Leah, anything else that we need to add administratively, or?
Just a big thank you to Anna again for joining us. Mathematica is dedicated to shaping a more just and equitable world, and this book really gives us a lot of great food for thought on how to do that, how to take action and use evidence and other innovative practices for addressing inequities. So thank you again for joining us. We look forward to hosting you again and looking into some of the other speaker recommendations that you made today. And thank you to our audience as well.
Absolutely.
Yes, and I'd
thank
like
you
to
so much,
call
Mathematica.
Yes, and I'd like to also kind of highlight the work of our organizers, Leah Caravallo, the past co-leads, Sean Stevenson and Kiana Hardy from the Black ERG, who helped to set this event up. And we'll ask you guys to stay tuned, and we will hopefully be planning events like this in the future. And once again, thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Thank you.